Most people think angels enter a house to make it feel safer, softer, lighter. They do not. When heaven steps into a house, the first thing it touches is not the furniture. It is the lie the people inside have been using to survive. The terrifying part is that nothing dramatic has to happen for you to feel it. The refrigerator still hums in the kitchen. The hallway light still flickers slightly because you keep meaning to replace the bulb. The dishes are still sitting in the sink from earlier that night. Your phone still glows beside you with notifications you do not want to answer. And yet the room suddenly feels heavier than it did 10 seconds ago. Not haunted. Honest. I remember one night sitting alone in a living room after midnight. There were papers spread across the table, half-finished work on my laptop, a cold glass of water beside my hand, and that strange silence that only appears when everyone else in the neighborhood has already gone to sleep. Nothing supernatural happened. No shadow crossed the wall. No voice spoke out loud. But I felt exposed. Not exposed because someone else had discovered me. Exposed because, for the first time in a long time, I could no longer hide from myself. There was a decision I had avoided for almost 2 years. I kept calling it wisdom. I kept calling it waiting for clarity. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was afraid of what honesty would cost me. Maintaining the illusion of peace had become exhausting. Pretending everything was stable had started draining more life out of me than the actual problem itself. And sitting there in that room, listening to the soft ticking of the clock above the kitchen doorway, I realized something that frightened me more than the decision itself. I had become addicted to avoidance. That is what holy presence often feels like at first. Not comfort, exposure. If angels are near your house, you may not see wings, you may not hear thunder, but you will notice that the house stops helping you pretend. The air begins to feel different. One of the strangest things about spiritual presence is how ordinary spaces suddenly stop feeling ordinary. In Genesis 18, Abraham sees 3 visitors standing near his tent in the heat of the day. At first, the scene is painfully simple. Dust, bread, water, shade, the exhaustion of afternoon heat, yet everything changes the moment heaven enters the scene. That is how it often works. The room itself does not physically change. You do. A chair suddenly feels like a witness. A doorway feels heavier. A table begins to feel almost sacred. You walk through your own house differently. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever walked into your kitchen and suddenly felt like your thoughts were louder than the room itself? Not because the house changed, because something inside you stopped running long enough to hear the truth. Sometimes it happens quietly. You place a glass down on the counter a little too hard. The television turns off, and the silence afterward feels unbearable. Rain taps against the window. A child laughs in another room. Someone closes a bedroom door softly down the hallway. And suddenly, your entire inner life feels visible. That is why angelic presence often feels serious before it feels comforting. Heaven does not enter a house to decorate it emotionally. It enters to tell the truth about it. And truth has weight. The hardest part is that the weight is usually connected to something you already know. Something unfinished. Something delayed. Something you keep stepping around every day. Maybe it is a conversation. Maybe it is grief. Maybe it is a relationship that already broke emotionally long before it broke officially. Maybe it is exhaustion you keep calling being busy. Maybe it is loneliness hiding underneath productivity. The room becomes heavy because your soul recognizes that pretending is becoming impossible. And once that happens, even the objects around you begin to feel different. The folded blanket on the couch, the shoes near the door, the half-empty mug beside the sink, the untouched Bible on the table, the light underneath a closed bedroom door. Nothing in the room is speaking, but everything suddenly feels like it knows. Fear stops being panic and becomes attention. When angels appear in Scripture, fear almost always appears first. Not because heaven enjoys terror, because human beings panic when control starts slipping away. In Judges 13, Manoah realizes he is standing before something holy. In Luke 1, Zechariah loses his speech after receiving a message he cannot manage or predict. Again and again, the same pattern appears. The presence of heaven interrupts the illusion that life belongs entirely to us. But there is a difference between panic and holy attention. Panic scatters you. Holy attention gathers you. You stop multitasking internally. You stop drifting mentally. You stop performing. You become fully present. That sounds beautiful until it actually happens. Because most people are not used to being fully present with themselves. We stay busy because movement protects us from clarity. We keep noise around us because silence exposes things. We scroll because distraction helps us avoid unfinished emotions. But when heaven draws near, distraction starts losing its power. You suddenly remember things you were trying not to remember. The apology you never gave. The call you avoided returning. The conversation you rehearsed 100 times but never entered. The prayer you stopped praying because you were angry. God did not answer it the way you hoped. Holy presence has a way of pulling unfinished things toward the surface. And honestly, that can feel terrifying. I think many people secretly believe they want God near them. Until they realize closeness to God usually means closeness to truth. And truth removes hiding places. That is why some of the deepest spiritual moments happen in completely ordinary environments. A parked car outside your apartment, a quiet hallway after an argument, a bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning, a kitchen after everyone else has gone to bed. Because holiness does not always arrive through spectacle. Sometimes it arrives through unbearable clarity. Small objects start carrying emotional weight. One of the clearest signs that spiritual presence is near is this. Ordinary objects begin carrying emotional meaning you cannot ignore anymore. A cup, a spoon, a lamp left on, a chair sitting empty across the room. In Genesis 18, Abraham rushes to prepare food for his visitors. In Hebrews 13:2, Scripture reminds us that some people have entertained angels without realizing it. That verse matters because it destroys the fantasy that holy moments only happen inside obviously spiritual environments. Sometimes heaven enters a kitchen. Sometimes it enters a dinner table. Sometimes it enters a tired family trying to survive another week. And when it does, the ordinary starts feeling unbearably important. The spoon clinks against the bowl louder than usual. Steam rises from soup on the stove. The washing machine hums in the next room. The dryer keeps thumping softly. A hallway light glows under a bedroom door. These are not dramatic details. They are human details, and that is exactly why they matter. I think many people imagine spiritual encounters as escapes from normal life. But Scripture keeps showing the opposite. God keeps entering normal life directly. Into tents, into kitchens, into bedrooms, into boats, into prisons, into exhausted households. That means your real life is not spiritually irrelevant. The problem is that many people stop seeing their own life clearly. Routine numbs attention. Familiarity dulls awareness. You stop noticing the emotional atmosphere of your own home because survival becomes automatic. But when heaven draws near, awareness returns. You suddenly realize how tired the room has been, how tense everyone has become, how careful people speak around each other, how often silence enters the house before peace does. And that realization hurts, because awareness creates responsibility. Once you truly see something, pretending not to see it becomes exhausting. That is why sacred presence feels expensive. It costs you your ability to comfortably ignore reality. The table starts revealing what everyone avoided. Not all silence is peace. Some silence is fear wearing polite clothes. And nowhere is that more visible than around a dinner table. Two people sit across from each other. The television stays on because nobody wants the room too quiet. Someone asks about work. Someone asks about school. Forks move carefully against plates. Water gets poured. A child laughs briefly from another room. And beneath all of it sits the real subject nobody touches. The grief, the resentment, the disappointment, the betrayal, the fear, the exhaustion. Everyone feels it. Nobody names it. That kind of silence slowly reshapes a household. The laughter becomes thinner. Meals become shorter. People start lingering in separate rooms longer than they used to. One person scrolls endlessly on their phone. Another stays late at work for no real reason anymore. Someone says, "I'm just tired," so many times that eventually the sentence becomes camouflage. I once had a friend describe a night in his house after a devastating loss in their family. The kids had already gone to sleep. The sink was still full of dishes. The television played quietly in the background, though nobody was watching it. He and his wife sat at the table with untouched food in front of them. Neither person knew how to begin the conversation. So they kept discussing meaningless things instead: schedules, groceries, work emails. And he told me something I have never forgotten. He said the room felt heavy enough that even breathing sounded loud. Nothing supernatural happened. That was the supernatural part. Because suddenly, the thing both of them had spent months avoiding felt impossible to escape anymore. That is often how holy presence works, not by adding noise, by removing your ability to hide behind it. In Scripture, angels rarely appear without speaking. Sarah receives a promise she struggles to believe. Mary receives a calling that changes her future forever. Cornelius receives direction that changes the destiny of his household. Heaven does not enter silence merely to observe it. It enters to confront what silence has been protecting. And sometimes the most painful realization is discovering that what you called peace was actually avoidance. That what you called patience was fear. That what you called wisdom was delay. That what you called stability was emotional paralysis. The body usually knows before the mind admits it. Shoulders tighten, jaws clench. People stop making eye contact naturally. The room becomes emotionally careful. And eventually the entire household starts adapting itself around what nobody wants to face. That is why truth feels disruptive. Because avoidance quietly reorganizes an entire home. The house becomes a threshold. A house is supposed to be a place where you rest. But when holy presence enters it, the house often becomes something else first: a threshold, a place of decision. In Scripture, angelic encounters rarely leave people unchanged. Abraham must respond to a promise. Mary must surrender to a future she did not expect. Lot must leave. Peter must rise. Again and again, heaven interrupts comfort. That is why spiritual nearness feels costly. It asks something from you. Not performance, not perfection. Honesty. And honesty changes things. You feel this when your room suddenly becomes too small for the lie you have been living inside. You sit in your parked car outside the house because you are not ready to walk inside yet. Your hand hovers above a message you know you need to send. You stand at the sink staring at running water while rehearsing conversations in your head. You hear footsteps in the hallway and instantly tense without knowing why. These moments matter spiritually more than people realize, because this is where the soul reaches a crossroads. One voice says, "Keep the routine. Keep pretending. Keep surviving quietly." The other says, "Enough. Enough hiding. Enough postponing. Enough calling numbness peace." Holy presence does not force the decision for you. It simply removes the fog around it. And once you truly see clearly, returning to unconsciousness becomes almost impossible. That is why some people become uncomfortable when they sense God near them. Not because God is cruel, because truth threatens every false structure holding their life together. And yet, that threat is also mercy, because God does not expose people in order to humiliate them. He exposes what is killing them slowly. The house can no longer pretend. The final sign is not lights, not visions, not supernatural phenomena. It is honesty. The house can no longer pretend. The refrigerator hum becomes noticeable. The floor creaks. The hallway lamp glows softly. A chair remains slightly pulled away from the table. A cup sits untouched for hours. Everything feels like a witness now. Not because the room is haunted, because the room has stopped cooperating with denial. And that honesty becomes demanding. It asks you to stop calling avoidance peace. It asks you to stop calling emotional distance maturity. It asks you to stop hiding exhaustion behind productivity. It asks you to admit that some of your suffering has not come from weakness, but from resisting truth for too long. That realization hurts deeply, but it also becomes the beginning of freedom. Because once pretending dies, response becomes possible. You can finally speak honestly. You can finally grieve honestly. You can finally confront what the entire household has been adapting around. You can finally stop performing stability while quietly collapsing inside. I think many people underestimate how exhausting emotional pretending really is. Pretending drains the nervous system. Pretending reshapes relationships. Pretending slowly turns people into strangers inside their own homes. Eventually, people stop living. They start managing appearances. That is why sacred presence feels both painful and relieving at the same time. Painful because exposure hurts. Relieving because hiding is exhausting. And maybe that is why heaven often arrives quietly. Because deep down, the soul already knows. It already knows the marriage is struggling. It already knows the grief was never processed. It already knows the anger underneath the politeness. It already knows the loneliness hiding underneath busyness. Holy presence simply removes the final layer of distraction. Conclusion: the house that finally told the truth. In the end, the greatest sign is not supernatural activity. It is honesty returning to the household, the chair near the table, the soft kitchen light, the spoon left in the sink, the hallway after midnight. The silence after a difficult sentence finally gets spoken aloud. These things become sacred because the people inside the house finally stop hiding from what they already knew. That is why this is not really a story about angels. It is a story about what happens when heaven enters the places where human beings have been surviving through avoidance. And maybe the deepest miracle is not that God speaks loudly. Maybe the deepest miracle is that He continues speaking softly long after people start hiding from themselves. So if heaven has been pressing gently against the walls of your life lately, if your house has started feeling emotionally heavier, if ordinary moments suddenly feel full of meaning, If silence has started exposing things you cannot comfortably ignore anymore, do not rush away from that feeling. Sit inside it for a moment. Listen carefully. Because sometimes the holiest thing that can happen in a house is not a miracle. It is the moment somebody finally tells the truth. Write this in the comments. My house will no longer survive through hiding.